Sometimes the deepest wounds come from those who should love you most. When 63-year-old Colt Merriweather lost his wife and family ranch in a bitter inheritance fight, his siblings mocked him as he left, calling him too old, too soft to start over. They laughed when he walked away into the mountains alone. Years later, high on a bluff overlooking a winding river, Colt proved them wrong. His hand-built cabin stands as quiet proof that healing doesn't need permission. He carves furniture, teaches local kids to whittle, and lives with a peace his family never thought possible. Then his great-nephew arrives, running from the same mistakes Colt once made. And what he built alone finally bring redemption to them both. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light came through the east-facing window the way Colt Merriweather had designed it to, soft and amber. Touching the foot of his bed first, before spreading across the pinewood floor, he'd laid himself. 5 years in these mountains, and he still woke with the sun, habits from a lifetime of ranching carved too deep to fade. He lay still for a moment, listening to the creek that ran 50 yards from his cabin. A constant whisper that had become the soundtrack to his solitude. The cabin measured 24 by 30 feet, modest by any standard, but every inch of it bore his touch. Hand-hewn beams crossed the ceiling, each one carried up from the valley below when his back was 5 years younger. The stone fireplace dominated the west wall, river rocks fitted together with such care that no mortar showed between them. 2 windows on each wall brought the mountains inside, and the furniture, every stick of it, came from his own hands. Colt pushed himself upright, feeling the familiar protest in his lower back and the stiffness in his right knee. 68 now, though he felt both older and younger depending on the day. His hands were what they'd always been, scarred, calloused but steady. A man's hands told his story better than any words, and Colt spoke of work, loss, and the slow patience of rebuilding. He dressed in the same uniform he wore most days, worn Levi's, a flannel shirt the color of rust, and boots that had walked more miles than he cared to count. The cabin's interior reflected a life stripped to essentials. A narrow bed with a quilt Emily had made 20 years ago. A kitchen table that seated 2, though only 1 chair ever got used. Shelves lined with books, mostly about woodworking, wildlife, and a few worn westerns. And everywhere the smell of cedar and pine, sawdust and wood smoke. The workbench sat beneath the largest window, positioned to catch the best light. Tools hung in precise order on a pegboard, chisels arranged by size, saws waiting for work, planes that fit his grip like old friends. And there, in the center of the bench, resting on a clean cloth, lay the leather journal, Emily's journal. Colt ran his fingers over the cover, soft leather worn smooth by years of handling. The binding had been red once, now faded to the color of clay. Inside were pages filled with Emily's neat handwriting, sketches of furniture pieces, notes about joinery and wood grain, measurements and modifications. She'd been the dreamer, seeing beauty in rough lumber and imagining what could be. He'd been the one who made those dreams solid. He opened to a random page, finding a drawing of a rocking chair with curved arms and a high back. Emily's note beside it read, "For the porch we'll build someday where we can watch the sunset and count our blessings." They'd never built that porch. There hadn't been time. The memory came without invitation, the way they all did. The funeral was on a Tuesday, cold for September even in Montana. Emily had been sick for 8 months, cancer moving through her like a quiet thief, taking pieces until there wasn't enough left to fight with. Colt had held her hand that last night, watching the rise and fall of her breathing grow shallow and slow, and when the sun came up, she was gone. The service was at the Baptist church in Millbrook, the town where both of them had been born and raised. The pews were full. Emily had taught Sunday school for 30 years and knew everyone. Colt sat in the front row, flanked by his brother Frank and sister Linda, accepting condolences in a fog. People said the usual things. "She's in a better place. At least she's not suffering. You were blessed to have her." All true, all meaningless in the face of the hole she left behind after the burial, after the last casseroles were delivered and the sympathy cards stopped coming. Colt had gone back to the ranch, the place his parents had built, where he and Emily had raised no children but countless cattle, where every fence post and barn beam held a memory. He'd thought he would live out his days there, tending what his father and grandfather had tended, keeping the land for the next generation, even if that generation wasn't his own. 3 months later, Frank called a family meeting. Colt remembered walking into the lawyer's office in town. The fluorescent lights too bright, the air conditioning too cold. Frank sat on one side of the big conference table, Linda on the other, both of them wearing expressions he couldn't quite read. Their mother had passed 2 years before, their father a decade before that. The ranch had been held in trust, the terms clear. Colt would inherit the main house and 200 acres. Frank would get the north pasture, Linda the hayfields. It had all been discussed, agreed upon, settled, but Frank slid a document across the table. "There's been a revision," Frank said. His voice was flat, businesslike. "Mom changed her will 6 months before she died." Colt picked up the papers, his hands suddenly clumsy. The words swam in front of him: revised testament, sound mind, previous will void. According to the document, their mother had decided the ranch should be divided differently. Frank would get the house and majority acreage. Linda would receive the remainder. Colt would receive $5,000 and personal effects. "This can't be right," Colt said, looking up at his siblings. "We all agreed. Mom had concerns," Linda interrupted. Her voice was sharp, accusatory. "She thought you'd been influencing her. Taking advantage." The words hit like a slap. "Influencing? Emily and I took care of her for 3 years. "Exactly," Frank said. "You had access, opportunity. The lawyer says there's nothing to contest. This is legal and binding." Colt stared at his brother, at his sister, seeing strangers where family should be. "You can't believe I would manipulate Mom. You can't believe what we believe doesn't matter," Linda said. "This is what she wanted. It's in writing." The meeting ended with signatures and handshakes, formal and cold. Colt walked out of that office feeling like he'd been gutted, the world tilting sideways. He'd lost Emily. Now he was losing the land they'd worked together, the home they'd made. And worse than the loss was the accusation hanging in the air that he'd somehow betrayed his own mother for profit. He'd had 2 weeks to clear out. The days that followed were a blur of packing and purging, sorting through a lifetime of belongings and deciding what to keep. Most of it he left behind. Furniture too large for wherever he was going. Photo albums Frank said he wanted. Tools that belonged with the ranch. But he kept Emily's journal. He kept his own toolbox, the one his father had given him when he turned 16. He kept his truck and a trailer loaded with lumber he'd bought for projects he'd never started. The day he left, Frank and Linda stood on the porch of the house that wasn't Colt's anymore, watching him load the last boxes. Frank's expression was hard, satisfied. Linda's mouth was set in a thin line. "Good luck out there," Frank called out, as Colt climbed into his truck. "You'll need it at your age." Linda laughed, a sound without warmth. "Too old to start over, Colt. Too soft for the real world. You've been playing cowboy on our parents' charity your whole life." Colt had looked at them both, these people who shared his blood but not his heart, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. He put the truck in gear and drove away from Millbrook, away from the ranch, away from every memory that mattered except the ones he carried in Emily's journal. He'd driven north into the mountains, no particular destination in mind. Just away, higher and quieter, where the towns grew smaller and the trees thicker. He'd found this spot by accident, a bluff overlooking a river valley, accessible by a rough logging road that hadn't seen use in years. 20 acres of timber and stone, owned by the state but forgotten. He'd filed the paperwork, paid the fees, and claimed it as a homestead. Then he'd started building. The first year was the hardest. He lived in his truck and a canvas tent while he cleared the site and laid the foundation. He cut timber and milled lumber by hand, the way his grandfather had taught him. Every beam was selected for strength and character, every joint measured twice and cut once. He worked from dawn until dark, and at night he sat by a campfire reading Emily's journal, using her sketches as blueprints for his new life. The cabin took shape slowly. Walls rose. The roof went on. Windows were set and chinked. By the second winter, he could sleep inside, though the fireplace wasn't finished and the floor was just plywood. By the third year, it was a home. By the fourth, it was beautiful. By the fifth, now, it was his refuge, his workshop, his proof that Frank and Linda had been wrong. Colt closed the journal and set it back on the workbench. The rocking chair was finished, his current project built from Emily's design. He ran his hand over the armrest, feeling the smoothness of the wood. Cherry, harvested from a fallen tree in the valley. The grain was deep red, almost burgundy in the morning light. He'd shaped it with patient hours of sanding, carved decorative curves into the back slats, fitted the joints without a single screw or nail. Traditional joinery, the kind that lasted generations. He carried the chair outside onto the porch, setting it beside the door. Later today, he'd load it in the truck and drive down to Pinewood, the nearest town. Mrs. Henderson had ordered it for her granddaughter's wedding gift. She'd paid half up front, the rest on delivery. It was good work, honest work, and it paid for what little he needed. The sun was fully up now, burning off the morning mist that hung in the valley. Colt stood at the porch railing, coffee in hand, looking out at the view that never got old. Pine-covered slopes rolling away in every direction. The river a silver thread through the bottom land, mountains stacked to the horizon. In 5 years, he'd seen maybe a dozen people up here. Hikers who'd wandered off trail, a forest ranger checking permits, neighbors from the valley who'd heard about the furniture he made. It was a quiet life, a small life maybe, but it was his. He finished his coffee and went back inside to pack the rocking chair properly. He wrapped it in moving blankets and secured it in the truck bed, taking care that nothing would shift during the drive down. The road from the cabin to the highway was rough, 12 miles of switchbacks and washouts that required attention and patience. The drive to Pinewood took an hour. The town sat at the base of the mountains, a collection of old buildings clustered around a main street that ran all of 3 blocks. Population maybe 800, though it swelled in summer when tourists passed through on their way to somewhere else. Colt knew the place well enough now, the general store, the diner, the post office where he collected the mail he rarely got. Mrs. Henderson lived in a white clapboard house on the edge of town, with a garden full of roses and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. She was waiting when Colt pulled up, a woman in her 70s with white hair and sharp eyes. "Right on time," she said, coming down the steps. "Let me see it." Colt unwrapped the chair carefully. Setting it on the grass so she could inspect it, Mrs. Henderson walked around it slowly, running her fingers over the wood, testing the joints. Sitting in it to check the rock. "It's perfect," she said finally. "Better than I imagined. Emma's going to cry when she sees this." "I'm glad," Colt said, and meant it. She went inside and came back with an envelope, counting out bills with practiced efficiency. "That's the balance, plus a little extra. You do fine work, Mr. Merriweather. Too fine for how little you charge." "It's enough," Colt said. She looked at him for a long moment, the way older people sometimes did, seeing past the surface. "You ever get lonely up there in those mountains?" "Sometimes," Colt admitted. "But lonely's not the same as alone." Mrs. Henderson nodded, understanding in her expression. "Well, you know where to find people if you need them. This town's small, but it's got room for one more." Colt thanked her and loaded the empty blankets back in the truck. He stopped at the general store for supplies, coffee, flour, beans, a few fresh vegetables, and at the post office out of habit. The clerk handed him a single envelope, forwarded from his old address in Millbrook. Back in the truck, Colt looked at the envelope. No return address, but he recognized the handwriting. His nephew Marcus. They'd been close once, before the inheritance mess, before everything fell apart. Marcus had sided with Frank and Linda, or at least hadn't stood against them. The betrayal had stung worse than his siblings' greed. Colt tossed the envelope on the passenger seat unopened and started the truck. Whatever Marcus had to say, he wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The drive back up the mountain felt longer than usual, the afternoon sun hot through the windshield. But as he climbed higher and the air cooled, as the trees closed in and the silence deepened, Colt felt the tension in his shoulders ease. This was his world now. Simple, solitary, sufficient. He parked beside the cabin and carried his supplies inside, putting everything away in its place. The envelope from Marcus sat on the kitchen table, accusing and ignored. Outside, the creek whispered its constant song, and somewhere in the woods, a thrush began its evening call. Colt opened Emily's journal again, turning to a new page. Tomorrow, he'd start the next project, a dining table 6 feet long with chairs to match. He'd sketch it out tonight, plan the cuts, select the wood. Build something else from nothing, one careful piece at a time. It was all he knew how to do. It was enough. 3 days later, Colt was splitting firewood when he heard the engine. It was faint at first, a distant whine that didn't belong to the forest's natural rhythms. He stopped mid-swing, the maul resting against his shoulder, and listened. The sound grew louder, laboring up the mountain road. A vehicle pushing hard against the grade. Nobody came up here by accident. The logging road led nowhere except his cabin, and even the GPS maps didn't show it. Colt set the maul against the chopping block and wiped his hands on his jeans. His pulse quickened despite himself. In 5 years, unannounced visitors numbered exactly 0. The forest ranger came once a year on a schedule. Mrs. Henderson had his number if she needed him. Everyone else in his life was either dead or had made it clear they wanted nothing to do with him. The vehicle appeared through the trees, a beat-up sedan, something Japanese and ancient, its blue paint faded to primer in patches. It coughed and wheezed the last 100 yards, finally shuddering to a stop next to Colt's truck. The engine died with a sound like relief. The driver's door opened, and a young man climbed out, unfolding himself in stages. Tall and thin, all angles and awkward grace, maybe 19 or 20. Dark hair that needed cutting, a few days of sparse beard growth, clothes that looked slept in. He stood by the car for a moment, taking in the cabin, the woodpile, Colt himself, and then his face broke into something between a smile and a grimace. "Uncle Colt?" he said. "It's me, Jesse." The name triggered a cascade of memory, pieces clicking into place. Marcus's son. The baby Colt had held at the hospital 19 years ago, the toddler he'd taught to feed chickens, the boy who'd followed him around the ranch, asking questions about everything. Colt hadn't seen him in more than 5 years, not since the inheritance fight when Marcus had cut all contact. "Jesse," Colt repeated, his voice rough from disuse. "What are you doing here?" The young man's attempted smile faded. He looked down at his shoes, back up at Colt, and shrugged with the kind of helplessness that came from having no good answer. "I didn't know where else to go," Jesse said. Colt studied him more carefully. The kid looked wrung out, dark circles under his eyes, a tightness around his mouth that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. His hands were shoved deep in his jacket pockets, and he was swaying slightly, the way exhausted people did when standing still took effort. "How did you find me?" Colt asked. "Mom mentioned it once. That you'd gone to the mountains near Pinewood. I asked around in town. Lady at the general store gave me directions. That would be Mary," Colt said. Then, because the kid was clearly in some kind of trouble, and because turning away family, even family that had turned away from him, wasn't something Colt could do, he gestured toward the cabin. "You look like you could use coffee." Jesse's shoulders sagged with visible relief. "Yeah, thanks." Inside, Colt put the kettle on and pulled down 2 mugs. Jesse stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking in the handmade furniture, the tools, the Spartan order of everything. His gaze snagged on Emily's journal, still open on the workbench. "This place is incredible," Jesse said quietly. "You built all this yourself?" "Every piece. Dad said you left with nothing, more or less." The kettle whistled. Colt poured coffee, handed Jesse a mug, and sat at the kitchen table. Jesse joined him, wrapping both hands around the mug like he was cold, despite the warmth of the day. For a long moment, neither spoke. Colt waited, giving the kid time to find his words. He'd learned patience up here, learned that silence wasn't empty but full, and that the truth came out better when it wasn't rushed. "I messed up," Jesse said finally. "I messed up bad. Most people your age do, Colt said. Question is what kind of mess? Jesse took a long drink of coffee, grimacing at the heat. I dropped out of college. Second year, just stopped going to classes. Dad was paying for everything, and I just couldn't make myself care about any of it. Business administration. He picked the major, picked the school. I felt like I was drowning, Colt nodded. It was a familiar story. Kid trying to live someone else's dream, suffocating under expectations. Dad found out last month, Jesse continued. Lost his mind. Said I was throwing away my future, wasting his money, acting like a child. We had this huge fight. I said some things. He said some things. Then he told me to get out and figure out my own life if I was so smart. So you left. Yeah, been couch surfing mostly, staying with friends. But that ran out. I don't have any money. I don't have a plan. I don't have anything. Jesse's voice cracked slightly on the last word. I remembered you. Remembered you were the one person who never pushed me to be something I wasn't. Thought maybe I could stay here for a bit. Just until I figure things out. Colt leaned back in his chair, studying his great-nephew. The resemblance to Marcus was strong. Same dark eyes, same stubborn jawline. But there was something else there too. Something Colt recognized from his own mirror. The look of someone who'd been told they weren't good enough and had started to believe it. Your dad know you're here. Colt asked, No, nobody does. I just started driving yesterday, didn't even know if I'd find you. He'll be worried. Jesse laughed, a bitter sound. He'll be angry. There's a difference. Colt took a sip of his own coffee, buying time to think. The smart thing would be to send the kid home. Tell him to work things out with his father, like an adult. But Colt remembered all too well what it felt like to be cast out by family, to have nowhere to go and no one who wanted you. He remembered Frank's mocking voice, Linda's cold dismissal, the way Marcus had stayed silent when Colt needed someone to speak up. Still, this was Marcus's son, a kid who'd done nothing wrong except be born into a family that knew how to hurt each other. You can stay, Colt said. For a while. Not forever. We'll need to figure out something more permanent. But for now, you've got a roof. Jesse's eyes went bright, emotion threatening to spill over. Thank you. I'll work. I'll help with whatever you need. I won't be a burden. You'll be a burden, Colt interrupted, but not unkindly. Extra mouth to feed, someone I have to think about besides myself. But that's all right. We'll manage. They sat in silence for a bit longer, the awkwardness of the moment settling into something almost comfortable. Then Colt stood and went to the small shelf by the door where he kept a few personal items. He pulled down an old shoebox, the cardboard soft with age, and brought it back to the table. Before you commit to staying with a stranger, Colt said, you should probably remember who I am. He opened the box and sorted through the contents, old photographs, mostly things he'd grabbed when leaving the ranch. He found the one he was looking for and slid it across the table to Jesse. The photograph was faded, colors washed out by time and sunlight. It showed a younger Colt, maybe 50, standing next to Marcus, who looked to be in his late 20s. Marcus was holding a baby wrapped in a blue blanket, grinning at the camera. Colt's hand rested on Marcus's shoulder, and the expression on his face was pure joy. That's you, Colt said, pointing at the bundle. Day you came home from the hospital. Your dad brought you straight to the ranch before even stopping at his own place. Said he wanted me to meet you first because I was going to be your honorary grandpa, since his own father was gone. Jesse picked up the photograph, holding it carefully by the edges. He stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. I don't remember any of this, Jesse said softly. I don't remember you being around when I was little. You were 5 when the inheritance mess happened, Colt said. After that, your dad stopped bringing you around. And can't say I blame him. Family politics get ugly and kids don't need to be in the middle of it. He never talked about you. Like you didn't exist. Easier that way, probably. Jesse set the photograph down, but didn't let go of it. His fingers traced the edges, and when he looked up at Colt, his eyes were wet. I used to ask about you, Jesse said. When I was maybe 8 or 9, I had these vague memories of someone teaching me things, showing me how to tie knots and use tools. Dad would just change the subject. Mom would get this sad look. Eventually I stopped asking. Colt felt something twist in his chest. a familiar ache that never quite went away. More collateral damage from Frank and Linda's greed, from Marcus's choice to stay silent. Not just his own loss, but this kid's too. Years of connection severed before they'd really begun. "Well," Colt said, his voice gruff to cover the emotion, "you're here now." "That's what matters." Jesse wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed. "Sorry, I'm just tired. It's been a long couple of months." "I expect it has." Colt stood and gestured toward the loft space above the main room. "There's a bed up there. Nothing fancy, but it's comfortable enough. Why don't you get some sleep? We can talk more when you're rested." "Okay." Jesse stood as well, swaying slightly. "Thank you, Uncle Colt, really." "Don't thank me yet," Colt said. "We've got a lot to figure out." Jesse climbed the ladder to the loft, and within minutes, Colt could hear the deep, even breathing of exhausted sleep. He sat alone at the table, the photograph still lying where Jesse had left it. He picked it up, studying the faces of his younger self and his nephew, the baby that had grown into the troubled young man now sleeping overhead. The past wasn't really past. It kept circling back, demanding to be dealt with. Colt had spent 5 years building a life separate from all of it, and now here it was again, asking him to care, to try, to risk being hurt. He put the photograph back in the box and closed the lid. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of orange and gold. Tomorrow, he'd have to decide what to do about Jesse, about Marcus, about the whole tangled mess. But tonight, he had wood smoke and coffee and the sound of someone else breathing in his home. It wasn't much. But maybe, Colt thought, it was a start. Jesse slept for 16 hours straight. When he finally climbed down from the loft, it was mid-morning of the following day, and Colt was outside planing boards for the dining table he'd been planning. "Coffee's on the stove," Colt called out when Jesse appeared in the doorway, blinking against the sunlight. "Help yourself." The kid looked better, still tired, still carrying whatever weight had driven him here, but more present. He'd changed clothes, though they didn't look much cleaner. He stood on the porch for a moment, coffee mug in hand, watching Colt work. "What are you making?" Jesse asked. "Dining table." 6 feet cherry wood. Got an order from a family down in Pinewood. Can I help?" Colt paused, considering. He worked alone, had worked alone for 5 years. Another set of hands meant teaching, explaining, slowing down. But the kid needed purpose, and idle time would only let him stew in whatever troubles he'd brought with him. "You ever worked with wood before?" Colt asked. "Shop class in high school. Made a birdhouse." "That's something." Colt gestured to the second plane sitting on his workbench. "Come here. I'll show you how to read the grain." They spent the morning on basics, how to hold the plane properly, how to let the tool do the work instead of forcing it, how to recognize when the blade needed sharpening. Jesse was clumsy at first, his strokes uneven, but he listened well and didn't complain when Colt corrected him. There was something methodical in the way he approached the work, a carefulness that suggested he was afraid of making mistakes. "You can't hurt the wood by trying," Colt said after watching Jesse hesitate for the 3rd time. "Worst case, we start with a new board. Best case, you learn something." Jesse nodded and tried again, this time with more confidence. The plane bit into the cherry, sending up a thin curl of shaving that caught the light. A small thing, but Jesse's face broke into a genuine smile. They worked until noon, when Colt called a break for lunch. Inside, Colt fried eggs and warm bread, and they ate standing at the counter the way men did when they were working. "Your car's going to need attention," Colt said between bites. "Sounds like the timing belt's about to go. Maybe the water pump, too. I don't have money for repairs," Jesse admitted. "I figured. We'll take a look at it this afternoon, see what we can do. I'm not much of a mechanic, but I can keep things running well enough." Jesse set down his fork, his expression troubled. "I need to pay my way somehow. I can't just live here for free. You're helping with the table, that's not enough." "That's barely anything." Colt studied him for a moment. The kid had pride, which was good, but also shame, which could be dangerous if it wasn't handled right. "Tell you what," Colt said. "You stay, you work. I'll teach you woodworking, proper and thorough. In exchange, you help with the daily stuff, firewood, hauling water, maintenance on the cabin. When you're good enough, you can help with commissioned pieces, and I'll pay you a cut." Fair. Jesse's face relaxed slightly. Fair, thank you. After lunch, they turned their attention to Jesse's car. The sedan sat like a dying animal in the dirt, its hood popped, its secrets exposed. Colt peered into the engine compartment, pointing out problems. Worn belts, leaking hoses, oil that looked like sludge. When's the last time you changed the oil? Colt asked. I don't know. Maybe never. I bought it used 6 months ago, Colt sighed. Well, that explains a lot. We'll start with the basics and go from there. They spent the rest of the afternoon working on the car, Jesse handing tools and asking questions, while Colt did his best to keep the vehicle alive for a few more months. It was dirty work, knuckle scraping and frustrating, but there was a companionship in it that surprised Colt. He'd forgotten what it was like to teach someone, to pass along knowledge that had been passed to him. As the sun started to dip behind the western peaks, Colt wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back. That should hold for now. But you'll need proper work done eventually, and that means money. I know. Jesse closed the hood carefully, almost reverently. I'll figure something out. They walked back to the cabin together, both of them tired and grimy. Jesse headed for the loft to get clean clothes. And that's when Colt noticed the backpack for the first time. Really noticed it. Beyond just registering its presence, it sat in the corner of the loft, visible from below, and it was in rough shape. The fabric was torn in places, held together with duct tape. The zippers were broken, tied shut with shoelaces. It bulged awkwardly, overstuffed with whatever Jesse owned, and the straps were frayed to the point of failure. That everything you brought? Colt called up. Jesse looked over the edge of the loft, following Colt's gaze to the backpack. Yeah, that's it. Everything I own that matters anyway. There was no self-pity in his voice, just a flat statement of fact, which somehow made it worse. 19 years old, and the sum total of his possessions fit in a bag that was barely functional. Colt thought about his own life at that age, a room full of belongings, a future that seemed wide open, family all around, even if they drove him crazy. Jesse had none of that. Tomorrow, Colt said, we'll go through it. See what you need that you don't have. Make a list. I don't need charity. It's not charity. Consider it part of your wages, room, board, and basic supplies. Can't have you working in clothes that are falling apart. Jesse didn't argue further, which told Colt the kid was too exhausted to maintain his pride. That was all right. Pride was important, but so was accepting help when it was offered honestly. That evening they ate a simple dinner of beans and cornbread. Jesse was quiet, lost in his own thoughts, and Colt didn't push conversation. After the dishes were washed and put away, Colt pulled out Emily's journal and began sketching the details of the dining table while Jesse sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Can I ask you something? Jesse said eventually. Go ahead. Why did you help me? After what Dad and the family did to you, I thought you'd slam the door in my face. Colt set down his pencil and looked at the young man across the room. The firelight played across Jesse's features, making him look even younger than he was, and Colt felt the weight of the question. You're not your father, Colt said simply, and you're not responsible for choices other people made. When you showed up here, you were alone and asking for help. Turning you away wouldn't have fixed what happened 5 years ago. It would have just made another hurt to carry around. But doesn't it bother you? Having me here? Some, Colt admitted. Won't lie about that. Brings up memories I'd rather leave buried. But it also gives me a chance to do something right. Maybe that matters more, Jesse nodded slowly, absorbing this. Then he said very quietly, I think Dad made a mistake. Back then, I mean. With what happened to you, that's not for you to worry about, but I do worry about it. He's so angry all the time now, and I wonder if it's because he knows he did wrong and won't admit it. Colt didn't have an answer to that, so he just returned to his sketching. After a while, Jesse climbed up to the loft, and soon the cabin was filled with the soft sounds of sleep. Alone with his thoughts, Colt looked at the sketch taking shape on the page. A table for 6, big enough for a family to gather around. Emily had drawn something similar years ago, imagining holidays and Sunday dinners, the kind of life they'd always meant to have, but never quite managed. He glanced up at the loft, where Jesse's battered backpack sat in the shadows. Everything the kid owned, compressed into a bag held together with tape and string. It reminded Colt of his own departure 5 years ago, leaving with just his truck, his tools, and Emily's journal. Starting over from less than nothing, maybe that's what you needed sometimes. To lose everything except what actually mattered, so you could figure out what to build next. Colt closed the journal and banked the fire for the night. Tomorrow they'd keep working. Tomorrow they'd keep building. It was all anyone could do. The days developed a rhythm. They woke with the sun, worked until midday, broke for lunch, then worked again until evening. Colt kept Jesse busy with tasks that built skills incrementally. Sanding boards, learning to sharpen tools, understanding how different woods behaved. The kid soaked it up like dry ground after rain, asking questions and practicing until his hands ached. A week after Jesse's arrival, Colt decided it was time to teach him carving. They sat on the porch in the late afternoon, the dining table project temporarily set aside. Colt had selected 2 pieces of basswood, soft and forgiving, perfect for beginners. He handed one to Jesse along with a small carving knife, the blade worn smooth from decades of use. "We're going to make spoons," Colt said, holding up his own piece of wood. "Simple kitchen spoons. Nothing fancy." Jesse turned the wood over in his hands, skeptical. "This is going to become a spoon, if you're patient." Colt demonstrated the first cut, showing how to grip the knife, how to cut away from yourself, how to let the blade follow the wood's natural grain. Carving's different from other woodworking. It's intimate. Just you, the knife, and the wood. You learn to feel what it wants to become. They worked in silence for a while, wood chips falling like snow onto the porch boards. Jesse struggled at first, his cuts too aggressive, his grip too tight. Colt watched, offering corrections when needed, but mostly letting the kid figure it out through trial and error. "I'm making a mess of this," Jesse said after half an hour, holding up his wood. "It looked more like a club than a spoon. That's how everyone starts." Colt showed his own progress, the rough shape of a spoon already emerging, the bowl carved shallow, the handle tapering to a comfortable grip. "I've been doing this for 40 years. You've been doing it for 30 minutes. Give yourself some grace." Jesse studied Colt's work, then returned to his own with renewed focus. The sun tracked across the sky, and gradually, the shape in Jesse's hands began to look less like firewood and more like something useful. "Tell me about Emily," Jesse said suddenly. Colt's knife paused mid-stroke. "What do you want to know?" "What was she like?" "I only met her once or twice when I was really little. I don't remember much." Colt considered the question, his mind drifting back through decades of memory. "She was steady," he said finally. "Patient. When everyone else would rush or panic, she'd slow down and think things through. She saw beauty in things other people overlooked. Old barnwood, wildflowers, the way light came through windows at certain times of day." "How'd you meet?" "Church picnic. I was 17, she was 16. I knocked over her lemonade, trying to impress her with some fool story, and instead of getting mad, she laughed. We were married 2 years later. That's a long marriage." 43 years, Colt said. The number still felt impossible. Not all of it easy, but all of it worth it. Jesse was quiet for a moment, his knife working steadily. "I don't think I've ever seen that. My parents barely tolerate each other. They stay together because divorce looks bad, but there's no warmth there. No partnership. That's a hard way to grow up. It's all I know." Jesse looked at his spoon, which was actually starting to resemble a spoon now. "Maybe that's why I couldn't make college work. Everything Dad wanted felt hollow, because I've never seen him happy. Why would I want his life?" Colt understood that reasoning more than he wanted to admit. He'd watched Marcus transform over the years, from an enthusiastic young man into someone hard and bitter, someone who measured success only in money and status. The inheritance fight had just revealed what was already there. "Your dad wasn't always like that," Colt offered. "When he was young, he had dreams. Wanted to be a photographer, travel the world. But his father, my brother, pushed him toward business. Said art was a hobby, not a career. Marcus folded, and I think part of him never forgave himself for it. So he's doing to me what was done to him. Patterns repeat unless someone breaks them." Jesse absorbed this, his hands moving more confidently now. The spoon in his grip was taking real shape, uneven and crude but recognizable. He'd found the rhythm of it, the way the knife should move, how much pressure to apply. "What made you different?" Jesse asked. "Why didn't you fold like Dad did?" "Emily," Colt said simply. "She believed I could do anything if I worked at it. When I doubted myself, she didn't. Made all the difference. They carved for another hour as the evening settled in, the temperature dropping, the sky turning the color of embers. Finally, Colt set down his knife and held up his finished spoon. It was elegant in its simplicity. Smooth curves, a balanced weight, the bowl perfectly proportioned for stirring or serving. "Now you try to finish yours," Colt said. "Take your time. Don't rush the final details." Jesse worked with intense concentration, his tongue caught between his teeth the way children did when they were focused. He sanded the rough edges, refined the bowl's depth, smoothed the handle until it felt right in his palm. When he finally held it up, there was pride in his face that Colt hadn't seen before. "It's ugly," Jesse said, "but it's mine." "It's not ugly. It's honest." "First one always is." Colt took the spoon, testing its balance, running his thumb over the surfaces. "You know what this is? This is proof you can make something from nothing. Something useful. Something that'll last." Jesse stared at the spoon in Colt's weathered hand, and something shifted in his expression. "Can I keep it?" "It's yours. You made it. No, I mean, can I keep making things?" "Learning this?" Colt handed the spoon back. "That's why you're here, isn't it?" That night after dinner, Jesse sat by the fire with his spoon, turning it over and over in his hands. It wasn't much to look at. The bowl was slightly crooked, the handle thicker on one end than the other, the wood showing hesitation marks where he'd cut too shallow and had to go back. But it was complete. It was functional. It was evidence of effort and improvement. Colt watched from his chair, working on his own projects, and felt something unexpected stir in his chest. Pride maybe, or hope. The kid had been here just over a week, but already he seemed different, less defeated, more present. Still troubled, still carrying whatever weight had driven him here, but beginning to see a path forward. "Uncle Colt?" Jesse said without looking up from the spoon. "Yeah? Thank you for not giving up on me. I know I showed up out of nowhere, and I'm probably more trouble than I'm worth, but I'm grateful." "You're not trouble," Colt said. "And you're definitely worth something." Jesse finally looked up, his eyes bright in the firelight. "How do you know?" "Because you made that spoon. Because you keep trying even when things are hard. Because you had the courage to ask for help when you needed it." Colt set down his own work. "Those things matter more than you think." They sat in comfortable silence after that, the fire crackling, the night pressing close against the windows. Jesse eventually climbed up to the loft, taking his spoon with him, and Colt heard him moving around, probably finding a safe place to store his first creation. Colt stayed downstairs, banking the fire and tidying the work area. He picked up the knife he'd let Jesse use, feeling its familiar weight. His own father had given him this knife 50 years ago, teaching him the same lessons on the same kind of porch in a different mountain range. The knowledge passing down, generation to generation, hand to hand. He thought about the spoon Jesse had made, imperfect and beautiful in its own way. Thought about the kid himself, broken but not beyond repair, looking for something to believe in. Thought about his own journey, leaving everything, building from scratch, finding purpose in the work of his hands. Maybe that was the real craft. Not making furniture or carving spoons, but making yourself into someone who could keep going when everything fell apart. Someone who could help others do the same. Colt looked at Emily's journal, still sitting on the workbench. In the margin of one page, she'd written a note he'd read 100 times. "The things we make with love are never wasted." He closed the journal and headed for bed, thinking about spoons and second chances, about the way small things could carry enormous weight if you let them. 3 weeks became 4, then 5. The cabin settled into the routine of 2 people instead of 1, and Colt found himself adjusting in ways both surprising and difficult. He'd grown used to silence, to making decisions without consultation, to moving through his days answerable only to himself. Now there was Jesse, asking questions, needing guidance, filling the spaces with his presence and his slow, steady progress. The dining table was nearly complete. Jesse had helped with much of the joinery, learning dovetails and mortise and tenon joints under Colt's patient instruction. His work wasn't perfect, but it was getting better, and more importantly, he was learning to see his mistakes before Colt had to point them out. "We'll deliver this on Friday," Colt said one morning, running his hand over the table's surface. The cherry wood gleamed in the light, 6 feet of functional art. "Then we start on the next commission." "What's that?" Jesse asked. Colt gestured to a corner of the workshop where another rocking chair sat, this one only half finished. "Mrs. Henderson ordered a matching chair for her granddaughter. I started it months ago but never finished. Figure now's as good a time as any." Jesse walked over to examine the chair. The basic frame was there, curved rockers, 4 legs, the beginning of a seat, but it lacked the detail work that would make it special. The back slats weren't carved, the arms were rough-shaped but not refined, and the whole thing needed hours of sanding and finishing. "Can I help with this one?" Jesse asked. "You're not ready for the carving yet, but you can handle the sanding, help with assembly. I'll show you what needs doing." They moved the unfinished chair to the main workbench, and Colt explained his vision: decorative curves in the back slats, smooth arms that would cradle whoever sat there, a finish that would bring out the wood's natural beauty. Jesse listened intently, already reaching for sandpaper, ready to begin. Over the next several days, they worked on the chair between other tasks. Jesse proved to have a good eye for detail, catching imperfections Colt might have let slide, suggesting adjustments that actually improved the design. There was something deeply satisfying about the collaboration, the way they moved around each other in the workshop now, anticipating needs, understanding the rhythm of the work, but beneath the surface progress. Colt sensed something unresolved in Jesse. The kid would go quiet sometimes, staring out the window at nothing, his hands still but his mind clearly elsewhere. At night, Colt could hear him pacing in the loft, restless and troubled. On a Thursday afternoon, while they were both sanding the chair's rockers, Jesse finally opened up. "I need to tell you something," he said, not looking up from his work. Colt continued his own sanding, giving Jesse space to find his words. "The thing with college, it wasn't just that I didn't like it. I failed out. Multiple classes. I stopped going because I was already too far behind to catch up, and I was too scared to tell Dad. When he found out, it wasn't just disappointment. It was proof of what he'd always thought, that I was weak, lazy, a screw-up." "You believe that?" Colt asked. "Sometimes. Maybe most of the time." Jesse's hands had stopped moving, the sandpaper hanging loose in his grip. "I look at what you've built here, how you started over from nothing, and I think I could never do that." "I don't have that kind of strength." Colt set down his own sandpaper and walked around the workbench to stand beside Jesse. He pointed at the unfinished chair. "See this? Started it last winter. Got the frame done, got excited about the idea of it, then hit a wall. Couldn't figure out how I wanted the back to look. Tried 3 different designs, hated them all. So I shoved it in the corner and forgot about it. Sat there for 6 months unfinished while I worked on other things. But you came back to it," Jesse said. "Eventually. After I stopped being frustrated with it. After I gave myself permission to not know the answer right away." Colt tapped the chair's arm. "Point is, everyone gets stuck. Everyone has projects they abandon or fail at, or can't figure out. The difference isn't strength, it's whether you're willing to try again when you're ready." Jesse absorbed this, his jaw working. "What if I'm never ready?" "Then you're not. And that's okay too. But I don't think that's true for you." They returned to sanding, the rhythm of the work soothing and steady. Outside, clouds were building over the western peaks, promising rain by evening. The cabin felt smaller somehow, more intimate, the walls holding in warmth and the accumulated presence of their shared weeks. "Tell me about building this place," Jesse said after a while. "How did you even start?" So Colt told him about arriving with nothing but his truck and some lumber, sleeping in a tent through that first brutal winter, clearing the site stone by stone, about the mistakes, the foundation he laid wrong and had to redo, the roof that leaked for 6 months until he figured out proper shingling, the chimney that smoked up the cabin until he rebuilt the flue. About the moments of doubt when he'd wondered if Frank and Linda were right, if he was too old, too soft, too broken by grief to do this. "What kept you going?" Jessie asked. Colt thought about that. Emily's journal. Every time I wanted to quit, I'd look at her sketches and remember that she'd believed in me, that she'd seen things in me I couldn't see in myself. Felt like I owed it to her memory to at least try. "That's love," Jessie said quietly. "I suppose it is." They worked until the light started to fade, making good progress on the chair. It was coming together now, the pieces finding their places, the vision becoming reality. Jesse's confidence had grown over the weeks. His hands were surer, his judgment sounder, his understanding of how wood behaved much deeper. That evening, after a simple dinner, they sat on the porch and watched the rain move across the valley. It came in sheets, grey and silver, turning the world soft and distant. Jesse had brought his wooden spoon with him, still carrying it like a talisman, and he turned it absently in his hands. "I should call Dad," Jesse said. "Let him know I'm alive at least." "Probably should," Colt agreed, "but then he'll want me to come back, or he'll say something that'll make me feel like garbage. Or both. Maybe. Or maybe enough time has passed that he's ready to listen." Jesse gave him a skeptical look. "You don't know my dad. I knew him when he was your age. People change, not always for the better." That was true enough that Colt didn't argue. They sat in silence, listening to the rain on the cabin's metal roof, watching lightning flicker in the far distance. The air smelled clean and alive, everything washed new. "What if I'm not ready to leave here?" Jesse asked. "What if I want to stay longer?" Colt considered the question carefully. Part of him wanted to say yes immediately. The kid was good company, helpful, learning well. But another part knew that this couldn't be permanent. Jesse needed to figure out his own life, make his own choices, not just hide in the mountains with an old man who'd done his own share of hiding. "You can stay as long as you need," Colt said finally. "But at some point you'll have to decide what comes next. This place can be a refuge, but it can't be your whole life. Not at 19, it's your whole life. I'm 68. I earned my solitude. You've got too much living ahead of you to lock yourself away." Jesse didn't respond, but Colt could see him processing the words, wrestling with them. The rain intensified, drumming harder, and they moved inside where it was warm and dry. The unfinished rocking chair sat in the corner, waiting for tomorrow's work. A reminder that some things took time to complete, and that patience was its own kind of craft. Colt looked at Jesse, at this kid who'd arrived desperate and was slowly becoming something more solid, and felt the weight of responsibility. It wasn't just about teaching woodworking anymore. It was about showing him that failure wasn't final, that starting over was possible, that the things you built with your own hands mattered even when, especially when, the world told you they didn't. The chair would get finished eventually, so would Jesse in his own way, in his own time. All Colt could do was keep working, keep teaching, keep showing up. The rest was up to the kid. The rain lasted 3 days, turning the world grey and close. They couldn't work outside, so they focused on the rocking chair and smaller projects. Cutting boards, small boxes, items that could be finished indoors. The enforced proximity of the cabin pressed them together, and conversations that might have stayed surface level went deeper. On the second day of rain, while Jesse was in the loft organizing his few belongings, he called down to Colt, "There's a box up here. Should I move it?" Colt looked up from the chair arm he was carving. "What kind of box?" "Wooden box, kind of dusty. Has your name carved in the lid?" Colt's hands went still. He knew exactly what box Jesse had found, the one he'd shoved in the loft's far corner 2 years ago and tried to forget about. The one that held 5 years of words he'd never sent. "Just leave it," Colt said. But Jesse was already climbing down the ladder, the box in his hands. It was made of pine, about the size of a shoebox, with Colt Merriweather carved in simple block letters on the lid. Jesse set it on the table, his curiosity plain. "What's in it?" "Nothing important. Then why's your name on it?" Colt set down his carving knife and walked over to the table. He stared at the box for a long moment, debating whether to put it back unopened or finally confront what was inside. The rain drummed on the roof, steady and insistent, and something about the grey day made secrets feel heavier. "Letters," Colt said finally. "Letters I wrote but never mailed. To who?" "Your dad. My sister and brother. Some to Emily, even though she's gone." He reached out and touched the box but didn't open it. "Started writing them about a year after I came up here. Thought it might help to get the words out, even if I never sent them. Can I read them?" Jesse asked, then immediately shook his head. "Sorry, that's private." "No, it's—" Colt paused, surprised by his own impulse. "Maybe you should read them. Might help you understand some things." He opened the box. Inside were dozens of envelopes, some yellowed, some newer, all addressed but unstamped. He sorted through them, selected 3, and handed them to Jesse. "These are to your dad. Read them if you want. I'll be outside." Colt grabbed his jacket and stepped onto the covered porch, leaving Jesse alone with the letters. The rain was lighter now, more mist than downpour, and he stood at the railing watching water drip from the eaves. His heart hammered in his chest, anxiety and something like shame mixing uncomfortably. Inside, through the window, he could see Jesse sitting at the table, opening the first envelope with careful hands. Reading words Colt had written in the deep loneliness of his first years here, when the silence had felt suffocating and the hurt still fresh. 20 minutes passed before Jesse came outside. His eyes were red, his face serious. "These are—" Jesse's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "You wrote to him every month for 2 years. Seemed like the thing to do. You told him you forgave him, over and over in different ways. You said you understood why he stayed silent during the inheritance fight, that you didn't blame him." "I didn't, still don't, but he blamed himself." "That's what you wrote, that you could see the guilt eating at him even back then." Jesse held up one of the letters. "You asked how I was doing. You told stories about things we did together when I was little. You said you hoped I was happy." Colt didn't respond, just watched the rain and waited. "Why didn't you send them?" Jesse asked, pride at first. "Thought if Marcus wanted to reach out, he would. Then fear, what if I sent them and got nothing back? What if it made things worse?" Colt turned to face his great-nephew. "Eventually, I realized the letters weren't really for him. They were for me, a way to process everything without having to actually face it." Jesse looked down at the letters in his hands. "There's one here from last year. You wrote about the cabin being finished, about the furniture you were making. You said you wished he could see what you'd built, that you thought he'd be proud." "I meant it, he would be. If he let himself." Jesse's jaw tightened. "But he won't. He's too stubborn, too angry. He's been angry my whole life, and I never understood why until now. It's not your job to fix him, I know. But reading these, seeing how you kept reaching out even when you got nothing back, it makes me think maybe I gave up too easy. On Dad, on school, on everything." Colt moved to stand beside Jesse at the railing. "You didn't give up. You made a choice to leave a situation that was hurting you. That's different, is it? Because right now it feels like running. Sometimes running and surviving look the same. You were drowning, Jesse. You found a way to breathe. Don't apologize for that." They stood together in the grey afternoon, the rain tapering to nothing, clouds beginning to break apart in the west. Jesse folded the letters carefully and handed them back to Colt. "There are more in there to Dad. Can I read the rest of them?" "If you want. And the ones to Emily, if that's okay." Colt felt something tighten in his chest. The letters to Emily were the rawest ones, written in the darkest times, full of grief and longing and the desperate attempt to keep her present somehow. But Jesse had earned the right to see them, to understand the full shape of loss and how a person learned to live with it. "Yeah," Colt said. "You can read those too." They went back inside, and Jesse spent the rest of the afternoon with the letters while Colt returned to his carving. The kid read silently, sometimes pausing to wipe his eyes, sometimes reading passages twice. Colt tried not to watch, tried to focus on his work. But his mind kept drifting to what Jesse was learning about him, the vulnerability in those letters, the admissions of weakness and doubt, the raw grief that hadn't made it into their daily conversations. When Jesse finally finished, the light outside was fading and the rain had stopped completely. He carefully placed all the letters back in the box and closed the lid. "Thank you," Jesse said, "for letting me see them. What do you think?" Jesse was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I think you're the strongest person I've ever met. But not because you built this place or because you survived what happened. Because you kept your heart open, even when it would have been easier to close it." Colt had to look away, the words hitting deeper than expected. "I want to write a letter," Jesse continued. "To Dad, not to send like yours. Just to get it out. Would that be okay?" "Course! Can you help me?" "I don't know what to say." They sat at the table together as evening settled in, and Colt showed Jesse the simple act of putting feelings into words. Jesse wrote haltingly at first, crossing out lines and starting over, but gradually found his rhythm. The letter wasn't long, just 2 pages, but it held years of confusion and hurt and the desperate wish to be understood. When Jesse finished, he folded the letter and put it in an envelope. He wrote his father's name on the front, then set it aside. "Maybe someday I'll send it," Jesse said. "Or maybe it'll just go in the box with yours." Either way, it helped. That's all writing ever does. Helps or it doesn't. You can't control more than that. They made a late dinner together, moving around the small kitchen with the ease of practice. The cabin felt warmer somehow, despite the grey day and the heavy topics. Something had shifted, not resolved but acknowledged. The letters in the box were no longer just Colt's secrets. They were shared now, part of the understanding growing between them. That night, Colt added Jesse's letter to the box and returned it to the loft. The rain started again, gentle this time, and he fell asleep to its rhythm, thinking about words written and words spoken, the difference between reaching out and connecting, and how sometimes the bravest thing was to keep trying even when success seemed impossible. The rocking chair sat half-finished in the corner, waiting for tomorrow's work. The letters sat in their box, holding 5 years of conversation with people who'd never read them. And Jesse slept in the loft above, carrying his own letters now, his own attempts to understand and be understood. Progress, Colt thought. Slow and imperfect, but progress nonetheless. The rain finally broke on the 4th day, and they delivered the finished dining table to Pinewood. The family who'd ordered it, the Johnsons, newer residents who'd bought a historic home on the edge of town, stood in their dining room and marveled as Colt and Jesse carried the piece inside. "It's magnificent," Mrs. Johnson said, running her hand over the cherry wood. "Absolutely worth the wait." They stayed for coffee and small talk, and Mrs. Johnson paid with a check and an invitation to dinner sometime. On the drive back up the mountain, Jesse was quieter than usual, staring out the window at the newly washed landscape. "You all right?" Colt asked. "Just thinking. That table's going to be in their family for generations. Long after we're gone, someone will sit at it and eat dinner and have no idea who built it. That bother you?" "No, kind of the opposite. It feels permanent in a way nothing else in my life has." They arrived back at the cabin to find a car parked in the drive, a newer SUV with Millbrook dealer plates. Colt's stomach dropped. He recognized that vehicle. It belonged to Linda's husband, Paul. "Stay here," Colt said, but Jesse was already climbing out of the truck. Paul stood on the porch holding an envelope. He was a thin man in his 60s, wearing slacks and a polo shirt that looked out of place in the mountains. His expression was uncomfortable, apologetic. "Colt," he said as they approached. "Been a long time, Paul." Colt stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "What are you doing here?" "Linda doesn't know I'm here. She'd kill me if she found out." Paul held out the envelope. "But I couldn't keep quiet anymore. You need to see this." Colt didn't move to take it.
"See what?"
"Just look, please." Jesse stepped forward and took the envelope, handing it to Colt. Inside were several pages of legal documents, photocopied but clear. Colt's hands shook slightly as he unfolded them. The first page was a letter from a law office in Bozeman, dated 3 weeks ago. It was addressed to Paul, marked confidential. Colt's eyes scanned the text, not quite processing what he was reading. "I don't understand," he said. Paul climbed down from the porch, standing a few feet away. 6 months ago, I started noticing discrepancies in our finances. Linda's spending didn't match what we had coming in, I hired a forensic accountant, thinking maybe she had a gambling problem or something. What he found was worse. Colt's heart was hammering now. Jesse moved to stand beside him, reading over his shoulder. "The will," Paul continued. "The revised one that cut you out. Linda forged it. Frank knew. They worked together to make it look legitimate, used a lawyer friend of Frank's to notarize it. Your mother never changed her will. She died wanting you to have the ranch house, just like the original will stated." The world tilted. Colt sat down hard on the porch steps, the papers fluttering in his grip. Jesse's hand steadied him, gripping his shoulder. "That's not possible," Colt said, but even as he spoke, pieces were clicking into place. The way Frank had rushed the proceedings, the way Linda had been so defensive, so aggressive, the way neither of them would look him in the eye at the lawyer's office. "It's all in there," Paul said, gesturing to the documents. "Cancelled checks for payments to the lawyer. Emails between Linda and Frank planning the whole thing. The original will, which my accountant tracked down through county records. Everything. Why?" Colt's voice broke on the word. "Why would they do that?" "Greed, pure and simple. Frank's ranch was failing, had been for years. Linda wanted the money to invest in some business scheme. They saw an opportunity when your mom got sick, when Emily died and you were grieving. They thought you'd be too broken to fight." "I was," Colt said quietly. "I know. And I'm sorry. I didn't know about any of this until now. The accountant just delivered his full report last week." Paul's face was anguished. "I wanted to tell you immediately, but I had to get copies of everything first. Linda keeps the documents in a safe, and I had to wait until she was away." Jesse was reading through the papers, his face growing darker. "This says the statute of limitations hasn't run out. Uncle Colt could still contest the will, get the ranch back." "He could," Paul confirmed. "The fraud voids everything. But it would mean a court case, probably years of litigation. And it would destroy what's left of the family." Colt looked up at his nephew-in-law, this man who'd married into dysfunction and was trying to do the right thing despite the cost. "Does Linda know you found out?" "Not yet, but she will soon. I can't stay married to someone who'd do this." Paul's voice was firm. "I've already talked to a lawyer about divorce. This kind of fraud, I can't be part of it." They sat in heavy silence. A raven called from the trees, harsh and mocking. Colt tried to make his mind work, tried to process what this meant, but the shock was too fresh. "There's something else," Paul said. "Something Linda let slip once, when she'd had too much to drink. She said Emily knew, that Emily had figured it out before she died." The words hit like a physical blow. "What?" "Emily found documents. Linda said something about Emily confronting her at the hospital, weeks before Emily passed. They argued. Emily was going to tell you, but she ran out of time. By the end, the cancer was too far advanced. She couldn't communicate clearly anymore." Colt remembered those final weeks. Emily slipping in and out of consciousness, trying to say things he couldn't understand, gripping his hand with desperate strength. He'd thought it was just the confusion of dying, the mind letting go. But maybe she'd been trying to warn him. Maybe she'd known his family was plotting against him and hadn't been able to make him understand. "I'm sorry," Paul said again. "I know this is a lot, but you deserve to know the truth." He turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth, I always thought you got a raw deal. You and Emily were good people. You didn't deserve what they did to you." Paul got in his SUV and drove away, leaving Colt and Jesse standing in the afternoon sun with a pile of papers that rewrote everything. Jesse was the first to speak. "We have to fight this. We have to make them pay." But Colt was thinking about the cabin around him, the life he'd built in 5 years of solitude. The ranch, his parents' house, the land he'd worked for decades, it was all still there, legally his, if he wanted to claim it. He could go back. He could take everything Frank and Linda had stolen. He looked at the papers again, really looked. Emails showing Linda searching for will forgery techniques, bank statements showing payments to a crooked lawyer, copies of the original will, notarized and filed, clear proof of his mother's real intentions. They'd lied. They'd cheated. They'd stolen his inheritance and made him believe he wasn't wanted, wasn't valued. And Emily had known. His dying wife had tried to protect him, and he'd been too consumed by grief to hear her. The rage came then, hot and clean. Not the helpless anger of 5 years ago, but something harder and more purposeful. They'd taken from him, and they'd gotten away with it, and now he had proof. "What are you going to do?" Jesse asked quietly. Colt stood, folding the papers carefully. "I don't know yet, but I need to think." He walked into the cabin, Jesse following. The walls he'd built by hand surrounded him. The furniture he'd crafted filled the space. Emily's journal sat on the workbench where it always sat. This place was his now, more truly his than the ranch had ever been, because he'd made it with his own labor and loss. But that didn't erase what had been stolen, didn't excuse the lies or the betrayal, didn't heal the wound of believing his own family thought he was worthless. Jesse sat at the table, giving Colt space, but staying close. The kid's presence was steadying, grounding. Colt put the documents down and stared at them, trying to decide what justice looked like after 5 years of living with a lie. Finally, he looked up at Jesse. "I need you to do something for me. Anything. I need you to call your father. Tell him to come here. It's time we all had a conversation." Jesse's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "No, but it needs to happen anyway." That night, Jesse made the call from the cabin's landline. The conversation was tense, brief. Marcus said he'd drive up the next day. When Jesse hung up, his hands were shaking. "He's angry," Jesse said. "About me being here. About everything." "Let him be angry," Colt replied. "Anger's something I understand." They spent the evening in near silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The documents sat on the table like an accusation, waiting for whatever came next. Colt tried to imagine confronting Marcus, Frank, Linda, his whole fractured family gathered in one place, forced to face the truth. Part of him wanted revenge, wanted to see them squirm, wanted to take back everything and make them pay. But another part, the part that had spent 5 years learning patience and peace, wondered if winning would cost more than it was worth. He thought about Emily, about her final days, about the secret she'd carried. He wished he could ask her what to do. But Emily was gone, and the choice was his alone. Tomorrow Marcus would arrive. Tomorrow the past would come crashing into the present. Tomorrow everything would change again, one way or another. Colt looked at Jesse, asleep in the loft, and felt the weight of responsibility. Whatever he decided, it would affect this kid too. Would shape how Jesse understood family, justice, forgiveness. He opened Emily's journal to a random page and found a note in her handwriting. "The hardest thing is knowing when to fight and when to let go." Words from beyond the grave, arriving exactly when needed. Colt closed the journal and sat in the darkness, waiting for morning and whatever truth it would bring. Colt woke before dawn, though he hadn't really slept. He'd spent the night in the chair by the cold fireplace, Emily's journal in his lap, thinking about choices and consequences. The documents from Paul sat on the table like a loaded gun, waiting to be fired. Marcus would arrive by afternoon. The thought sat in Colt's stomach like a stone. He made coffee as quietly as he could, trying not to wake Jesse, but the kid appeared at the top of the ladder within minutes. His hair standing up, his eyes heavy. "Couldn't sleep either?" Jesse asked. "Not much." Colt poured a second cup and handed it to Jesse. "You don't have to be here for this. When your dad arrives, you could go for a walk. Give us space." "No way. I'm staying." Jesse's jaw was set, determined. "Whatever happens, I need to see it." They spent the morning working on the rocking chair, though neither of them could focus properly. Colt's cuts were imprecise, his mind elsewhere. Jesse sanded the same spot over and over until Colt finally took the sandpaper from his hands. "Let's take a break," Colt said. They walked down to the creek, following the narrow path through the pines. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, the sound soothing in its constancy. They sat on a fallen log, watching the current, not speaking for a long while. "What are you going to do?" Jesse finally asked. "With the documents, I mean. Still deciding. But you could get everything back. The ranch, the house, all of it. They'd have to pay for what they did." Colt picked up a smooth stone and turned it over in his palm. "I could. Court case would take years, cost a fortune in legal fees. Even if I won, what would I have? A piece of land I don't want anymore, filled with memories that would just hurt. And a family that would hate me even more than they already do. They deserve to be exposed. Maybe. But that doesn't mean I deserve the life that comes after. Sometimes winning still leaves you worse off. Jesse threw his own stone into the creek, watching the splash. So you're just going to let them get away with it? I didn't say that. Colt stood, brushing dirt from his jeans. I said I'm still deciding. There's more than one way to make someone face what they've done. Back at the cabin, Colt went to his bedroom, a small space partitioned off from the main room with just enough room for a bed and a dresser. He opened the top drawer and reached beneath his folded shirts, finding the small wooden box he kept there. Inside was Emily's wedding ring. He'd taken it off her finger the day she died, sitting beside her hospital bed after the nurses had left them alone for final goodbyes. The ring was simple gold, worn thin from 43 years of wear. Inside was an inscription they'd had added on their 10th anniversary. Steady and true. Colt held the ring up to the window light, watching it catch and reflect. He'd kept it all these years, unable to wear it himself, but unable to put it away permanently either. It had traveled with him from the ranch to the mountains, always in his pocket or around his neck on a chain. A physical reminder of promises kept and love that endured beyond death. He put the ring on its chain and clasped it around his neck, feeling the weight of it against his chest. If he was going to face his family, he needed Emily with him somehow. Jesse was cleaning up the workshop when Colt emerged. The kid glanced at the chain around Colt's neck but said nothing, understanding somehow that this was armor, preparation. He'll be here soon, Jesse said, checking his phone. Dad texted, he's about an hour out. All right. Colt looked around the cabin, seeing it as Marcus would see it, rough and simple, miles from anywhere, the product of an old man's stubborn pride. Would Marcus understand what this place meant? Would he see the accomplishment or just the isolation? I should set out chairs, Colt said. Can't have this conversation standing. They arranged the furniture, the kitchen table pulled toward the center of the room, chairs positioned around it. Colt made sure there were 4 seats, space for him, Jesse, Marcus, and the ghost of everything unspoken between them. While they worked, Jesse kept stealing glances at Colt, his expression worried. What? Colt finally asked. I'm scared, Jesse admitted. Of what Dad might say, of how angry he'll be, of what happens after. That's wisdom, not weakness. Fear means you understand the stakes. Aren't you scared? Colt touched the ring through his shirt, feeling its solid presence. Terrified. But I've been running from this for 5 years. Time to stand still and deal with it. They heard the engine before they saw the vehicle. A truck, newer and cleaner than Colt's, climbing the rough road with determined purpose. It pulled into the clearing and stopped, and Marcus climbed out. He'd aged since Colt had last seen him. More gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes, a hardness to his posture that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. He stood by his truck for a moment, taking in the cabin, his son, his uncle, and his expression was unreadable. Marcus, Colt said from the porch. Colt. Marcus climbed the steps, stopping a few feet away. His eyes flicked to Jesse. You look like hell. Good to see you too, Dad, Jesse said, his voice tight. We need to talk, Marcus said to Colt, ignoring his son. Inside. They filed into the cabin, the space suddenly feeling too small for the 3 of them and all their accumulated hurt. Marcus sat at the table without being invited, his movements stiff and controlled. Jesse took the chair across from him. Colt remained standing, leaning against the counter, his arms crossed. I don't appreciate you harboring my son, Marcus began. He's got responsibilities, obligations. Running away doesn't solve anything. He didn't run away, Colt said calmly. He asked for help, and I gave it. Help? You're letting him hide up here instead of facing his problems. That's not help, that's enabling. Jesse's hands clenched on the table. I'm right here, Dad. You could try talking to me directly. Marcus's jaw tightened. Fine, you want direct? You threw away 2 years of college, thousands of dollars in tuition, and your future prospects. For what? To play mountain man with someone who couldn't hack the real world? The insult landed, sharp and intended. Colt felt Emily's ring against his chest and forced himself to stay calm. I dropped out because I was drowning, Jesse said, his voice shaking. Because you picked a major I hated, a school I didn't want to attend, a future that had nothing to do with who I am. I tried to tell you, but you wouldn't listen, because you don't know what you want. You're 19. When I was your age, when you were my age, you wanted to be a photographer, Colt interrupted quietly. You wanted to travel the world, capture beauty, make art, but your father pushed you into business, and you let him. Marcus's head snapped toward Colt. You don't get to talk about my father. Not after what you did, what I did. Colt's calm fractured slightly. What exactly did I do, Marcus? You manipulated Grandma, got written into the will when you shouldn't have been. Caused all that mess with Frank and Linda. Colt straightened, reaching for the documents on the counter. He set them on the table in front of Marcus with deliberate care. Read those, Colt said. Then we'll talk about who manipulated who. Marcus picked up the papers, scanning the first page. His expression shifted. Confusion, then disbelief, then something that might have been horror. He read faster, flipping through emails and bank statements and legal documents, his face growing paler. Where did you get these? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Paul brought them. Yesterday. Seems he hired a forensic accountant, found out Linda forged the revised will. Frank was in on it. They planned the whole thing while Emily was dying, and I was too broken to notice. Marcus set down the papers, his hands trembling. I didn't know. Colt, I swear I didn't know. But you suspected. You stayed silent at that lawyer's office. Let them steamroll me, because some part of you wondered if their accusations were true. Easier to believe I was the bad guy than to think your own family would lie. Marcus's voice broke. I didn't want to believe, but you did believe. You cut me out of your life, kept Jesse away from me, acted like I'd never existed. Because it was easier than standing up to Frank and Linda. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Jesse was watching his father with an expression Colt couldn't quite read. Not anger, but something deeper, sadder, understanding maybe, and disappointment. Marcus's shoulders sagged. He looked older suddenly, diminished. What are you going to do? Sue them, press charges. I haven't decided yet, Colt said. He sat down at the table finally, across from Marcus. Part of me wants to drag them through court, expose what they did, take back everything they stole. But Emily knew. Colt touched the ring through his shirt. Paul said she found out, tried to tell me before she died. She carried that secret to her grave, trying to protect me even when she couldn't speak anymore. And I keep thinking about what she would want me to do now. Marcus wiped his eyes, not quite crying, but close. She always saw the best in everyone, even when they didn't deserve it, especially then. Colt leaned forward. So I'm asking you, Marcus, nephew to uncle, father to son, one broken man to another. What would make this right? What would actually heal what's been broken? Marcus looked at his son, at Colt, at the documents spread across the table. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I don't know. I honestly don't know. But I'm sorry for staying silent, for cutting you out, for not believing in you when I should have. I'm sorry, it wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough. Not to erase 5 years of exile and pain. But it was a start, the first honest thing Marcus had said in longer than Colt could remember. Jesse spoke up, his voice quiet but steady. I know what would make it right, or at least better. They both looked at him. Truth, Jesse said. Tell Frank and Linda that you know, that we all know. Make them face what they did, even if it's not in a courtroom. And then, he looked at his father, we figure out how to be a family again. A real one, not whatever broken thing we've been pretending. Colt reached up and closed his hand around Emily's ring, feeling its warmth from resting against his heart. Steady and true. That's what they'd promised each other, what they'd tried to be even when everything else failed. All right, Colt said. We'll do it that way. Truth first. Then we see what's left to build with. Marcus nodded, his relief visible. Jesse sagged in his chair, the tension draining out of him. They sat together at the handmade table in the cabin Colt had built from nothing, 3 generations of the same family, broken and attempting repair. Outside, the afternoon sun painted the mountains gold, and a hawk circled overhead, riding thermals toward some destination only it could see. Tomorrow they would confront Frank and Linda. Tomorrow everything would come into the light. But tonight they would try to remember how to be in the same room without weapons drawn, how to speak without decades of hurt poisoning every word. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't even close. But it was the beginning of something, and that was more than Colt had hoped for when he woke before dawn, wondering if this day would destroy what little he'd rebuilt. Emily's ring rested against his heart, steady and true. He closed his eyes and thought he could almost hear her voice, telling him he was doing the right thing. That courage looked like this, messy and uncertain and real. They drove to Millbrook the next morning in 2 trucks, Colt and Jesse in one, Marcus following behind. The 3-hour drive passed mostly in silence, each of them lost in thoughts about what was coming. Colt kept Emily's ring on its chain, his hand occasionally rising to touch it through his shirt, drawing strength from its presence. The ranch looked the same as it always had. White farmhouse with a wraparound porch, red barn slightly weathered, fields stretching toward the mountains. Colt had spent 40 years of his life here, and seeing it now brought a complicated mix of emotions: nostalgia, anger, loss, and something that might have been grief for the home he'd loved that had been stolen from him. Frank's truck sat in the driveway. Linda's sedan was parked beside it. Marcus had called ahead, told them there was family business that needed discussing, but hadn't explained what. The element of surprise was important, Colt had insisted. Let them be comfortable, unsuspecting before the truth landed. They climbed out of the trucks and stood together for a moment, a united front. Jesse looked pale but determined. Marcus's jaw was set. Colt felt strangely calm now that the moment had arrived, as if he'd been moving toward this confrontation for 5 years and was finally ready to meet it. The front door opened before they could knock. Frank stood there, older and heavier than Colt remembered, his face creased with suspicion. "What's this about?" Frank demanded, looking from Marcus to Colt. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Colt. "What the hell is he doing here?" "Family meeting," Marcus said. "We're all going to sit down and talk." "I've got nothing to say to him." Frank started to close the door, but Marcus put his hand against it. "Yes, you do. And you're going to say it now." Linda appeared behind Frank, and her expression went from curious to hostile the instant she saw Colt. "Get off this property. You're not welcome here." "Funny thing about that," Colt said, his voice level. "Turns out this property should still be mine. So technically you're trespassing." Frank's face flushed red. "We went through the courts. The will was clear. The forged will was clear," Marcus interrupted. "Let's be accurate." The color drained from both Frank's and Linda's faces. They looked at each other, a moment of panic passing between them, and Colt knew with absolute certainty that every word in Paul's documents was true. "I don't know what lies Paul told you," Linda said, recovering slightly, "but he's been having some kind of breakdown." "You can't believe anything. I have the documents," Colt said. He held up the envelope. "Emails, bank statements, proof that you paid a lawyer to forge Mom's signature. Proof that you planned this while Emily was dying, while I was too broken to fight back." Frank's bluster collapsed. Linda's mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging. They stood in the doorway like trapped animals, looking for an escape that didn't exist. "Inside," Marcus said firmly. "We're doing this properly." They filed into the house, into the dining room where Colt and Emily had hosted countless Sunday dinners, holiday meals, celebrations. The table there now was cheap particle board, nothing like the solid oak one his parents had owned, the one Emily had polished until it gleamed. Frank and Linda had sold that table, probably, along with most of the other furniture that held memories. But they'd kept one piece, a smaller table, handcrafted, sitting against the far wall. Colt recognized it immediately. He'd built it himself 20 years ago, a gift for his mother's 70th birthday. 6 feet of solid walnut with hand-carved legs and a surface smooth as glass. It had survived the purge because even Frank and Linda recognized quality when they saw it. "Sit," Colt said, gesturing to the cheap table. "All of us." They sat reluctantly, Frank and Linda on one side, Colt, Marcus, and Jesse on the other. The documents lay between them, like evidence at a trial. I've spent 5 years believing I wasn't wanted, Colt began, his voice quiet, but carrying weight. 5 years thinking my own family saw me as a manipulator, someone who'd take advantage of a dying woman. 5 years building a new life because the old one was stolen from me. Colt, we can explain, Linda started, but Colt held up his hand. No, you're going to listen. For once in your lives, you're going to hear what your choices cost. Frank slumped in his chair, his defiance crumbling. Linda's hands twisted in her lap, her eyes darting between the door and the documents, calculating escape routes or lies. Colt couldn't tell which. Emily knew, Colt continued. She figured it out before she died. Tried to warn me, but the cancer had taken too much. She died carrying your secret, trying to protect me from this truth. Linda's face crumpled. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We were desperate. The ranch was failing. What you needed was integrity, Marcus cut in. What you needed was to act like family instead of thieves. The words hung in the air, brutal and true. Jesse sat silent beside Colt, watching his grandfather and great-aunt face the consequences of their choices, learning what betrayal looked like when you stripped away all the justifications. Colt looked at the table he'd built 2 decades ago, still standing solid against the far wall, outlasting marriages and honor and family bonds. He'd built it with his hands, with care and skill and love, and it had endured. Unlike the people who'd owned it. Here's what's going to happen, Colt said. Colt let the silence stretch, watching Frank and Linda squirm. They'd wielded power over him once, made him feel small and unwanted. Now the tables had turned, and he could see fear in their eyes, fear of courts, of public shame, of losing everything they'd stolen. I could take you to court, Colt said finally. Press charges for fraud. The statute of limitations hasn't expired. I'd win. You'd lose the ranch, possibly face criminal penalties. Your reputations would be destroyed. Please, Linda whispered. Please don't. But I'm not going to do that. Frank's head snapped up, confusion and hope warring on his face. What? I'm not going to sue you. I'm not going to press charges. I'm not taking the ranch back. Marcus turned to look at Colt, shocked. Why not? They deserve to pay. They do. But not that way. Colt leaned forward, his eyes locked on his siblings. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to sell the ranch, all of it. The house, the land, everything. You're going to split the proceeds 3 ways, equal shares. My third goes into a trust for Jesse's education. Whatever path he chooses. Jesse made a small sound of protest. But Colt continued, you're going to write a letter, both of you, acknowledging what you did, apologizing, not to me, to Emily's memory. Those letters stay sealed unless you ever try to claim you were in the right. Then they become public. That's it. Frank said, disbelief evident. That's all? No, one more thing. Colt stood and walked to the handmade table against the wall, the one he'd built for his mother. He ran his hand over its surface, feeling the grain, remembering the hours spent shaping each piece. I'm taking this. It's the only thing in this house that still belongs to me. He gestured to Jesse and Marcus, and together they lifted the table. It was heavy, solid walnut, built to last generations. They carried it out to Colt's truck, securing it carefully in the bed. When they came back inside, Frank and Linda hadn't moved. Why? Linda asked, her voice broken. Why are you letting us keep anything? Colt sat back down, and now his calm facade cracked slightly, emotions seeping through. Because I spent 5 years learning how to let go of anger. I built a life from nothing, and it taught me that revenge doesn't rebuild what's broken. You took the ranch, but you gave me something too, freedom from this place, from this family's poison. I don't want to spend what's left of my life fighting you. But we deserve punishment, Frank said quietly. You'll punish yourselves. Every day you stay here, every time you look at what you've got, you'll know how you got it. That's sentence enough. Marcus pulled out a notepad and pen, sliding them across the table to Frank. Write the terms down. We're not leaving until this is signed and witnessed. For the next hour, they hammered out details. Frank would contact a realtor within the week. The sale would proceed quickly, fairly. The letters of confession would be written and held by Marcus. The trust for Jesse would be established through Marcus's lawyer. Every detail spelled out, every loophole closed. When it was done, they all signed. Colt's hand was steady as he wrote his name, thinking about Emily, about the life they'd planned here, about the boy he'd been, who'd thought family meant forever. They stood to leave, and Linda caught Colt's arm. "I'm sorry," she said again, and this time there was genuine anguish in her voice. "I was desperate and angry, and I convinced myself you'd be fine, that you didn't need the ranch like we did. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." Colt looked at his sister, really looked at her. She was old now, tired, carrying the weight of her choices. He felt pity more than anger, and that surprised him. "I know," he said simply. Outside, they loaded the last of what Colt wanted, his old toolbox from the barn, the one his father had given him on his 16th birthday. It was battered and worn, covered in paint and oil stains, but every tool inside still worked. He'd left it behind 5 years ago, thinking he'd never return. Now he held it like a recovered treasure. The three of them stood by the trucks, looking back at the house one last time. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked. "You could still fight for it all, I'm sure. That house stopped being home when Emily died. I've got a new home now." Jesse was quiet, staring at the ranch with an unreadable expression. Finally, he turned to Colt. "You could have destroyed them. Why didn't you?" Colt thought about the question, about 5 years of woodworking and solitude, about Emily's journal and the life he'd rebuilt from nothing, about this kid beside him learning what forgiveness looked like when it was real and costly. "Because destruction's easy," Colt said. "Building something better is hard. I chose hard." They climbed into the trucks and drove away, the table and toolbox secured in the back, symbols of what endured when everything else fell apart. In the rearview mirror, Colt watched the ranch shrink and disappear, and he felt nothing except relief that this chapter was finally closed. The drive back to the mountains was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Marcus followed close behind, and Colt knew something had shifted between them. Not fixed entirely, but bent back toward connection. It would take time, years maybe, but the work had begun. Jesse fell asleep against the window, exhausted from the confrontation. Colt drove with one hand on the wheel and the other touching Emily's ring through his shirt, thinking about her final days, about the secret she'd carried, about her belief that love could outlast betrayal. She'd been right. Love did outlast. But it changed shape, became something harder and more honest, and sometimes that was enough. 6 months later, the cabin on the mountain had expanded. Not physically. The structure remained the same, 24 by 30 feet, but in the life contained within its walls. Jesse had stayed through fall and into winter, his battered backpack replaced by proper belongings, his skills growing under Colt's patient instruction. The kid could cut dovetails now, read wood grain like a language, understand when to force and when to yield. Marcus visited twice a month, sometimes staying for dinner, sometimes just dropping off supplies and catching up. The conversations were still careful, still navigating years of damage, but they were happening. That counted for something. The ranch had sold in November, well above asking price. A young family bought it, their kids already running through the fields, bringing noise and life back to the property. Colt had driven past once, just to see, and felt nothing but gladness that someone else was writing new memories there. The trust for Jesse was established and funded. Frank and Linda's letters sat in Marcus's safe, unread by anyone except their authors, insurance against backsliding. Frank had moved to Arizona, Linda to Oregon, the family scattering like seeds on wind. Better that way, Colt thought. Some distances were necessary for healing. On a December afternoon, with snow falling soft outside the windows, Colt and Jesse worked together on a commissioned piece, a hope chest for a couple in pine wood. Cherry wood with dovetailed corners and hand-carved panels on the front. Jesse was doing the carving now, his hands confident, his design elegant and simple. "You're ready," Colt said, watching the kid work. "For what?" "To take commissions yourself. Build your own pieces, develop your own style." Jesse set down his carving knife, surprised. "You think so?" "I know so. You've got the skills. More importantly, you've got the patience and the eye. Those can't be taught." Jesse turned back to the hope chest, running his fingers over the carved pattern. I've been thinking about that. About what comes next. And I want to stay here, keep learning from you, but also start my own work. Maybe eventually build a second workshop, make this a real business. 2 generations working together. Colt felt emotion tighten his throat. That sounds good. Dad's been talking about maybe moving closer. Not right here, but within an hour. Says he's tired of the city. You'd be all right with that? Jesse considered the question. Yeah, I think I would. We're not fixed, me and Dad, but we're better. And I think we could be better still if we had time together that wasn't about fighting or running away. They worked in comfortable silence until the light began to fade. Colt started dinner while Jesse cleaned the workshop, a division of labor they'd fallen into naturally. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and cooking food, of coffee and pine sap, all the sense of home. After dinner, Jesse pulled out something he'd been hiding, a leather journal, new and unstained, with blank pages waiting to be filled. I got this in town last week, Jesse said, setting it on the table between them. Thought I'd start keeping track of designs, like Emily did. Colt picked up the journal, feeling its weight, its possibility. She'd like that. Would you show me some of her sketches? I want to understand how she thought about design, how she saw things. They spent the evening going through Emily's journal together, Colt explaining the notes and drawings, telling stories about the pieces they'd built from her plans. Jesse took notes in his own journal, asking questions, making connections between Emily's ideas and his own emerging style. She was really talented, Jesse said, studying a particularly intricate design for a secretary desk. Why didn't she build more herself? Different times. Women weren't encouraged to work with tools the way men were, but she found ways to create anyway, through me, through our partnership. Everything I built had her fingerprints on it. Jesse nodded, understanding. Then he turned to a fresh page in his own journal and began sketching. A small side table with curved legs and a drawer front that echoed the carving he'd been doing on the hope chest. His first original design, taking what he'd learned and making it his own. Colt watched, pride and something deeper settling in his chest. This was what Emily had wanted, not just furniture, but legacy. Knowledge passed down, beauty created, purpose found in the work of hands and heart. The snow fell heavier outside, turning the world white and quiet. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling. 2 men bent over their journals in the lamplight. One recording decades of memory, one sketching the future he was building one piece at a time. Uncle Colt. Jesse said without looking up from his drawing. Yeah? Thank you. For everything. For taking me in, teaching me, showing me what it means to build a life on your own terms. You did the hard part. I just gave you space to figure things out. Still, I wouldn't be here without you. Colt closed Emily's journal and stood, moving to the window. Outside, the valley was disappearing under fresh snow, everything clean and new. In the glass, he could see Jesse's reflection, bent over his work, completely absorbed. Could see the cabin interior, warm and lived in, full of the furniture they'd made together. Could see his own reflection, older but not broken, tired but not defeated. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, loss and betrayal, grief and exile, the slow, patient work of rebuilding. Thought about Emily, about her belief that beautiful things could come from pain if you were willing to work for them. Thought about Frank and Linda, still living with their choices, and Marcus, trying to reconnect with his son and his uncle, trying to become someone better than he'd been. And he thought about himself, about the cowboy who'd left town, mocked and dismissed, too old and too soft to start over. The cabin proved them wrong. So did the furniture filling homes in 3 counties. So did Jesse, transformed from a lost kid to a craftsman finding his path. What Colt had built wasn't just wood and nails. It was proof that healing could be handmade, that second chances were real, that the things you created with love mattered more than the things you lost. Come on, Colt said, turning from the window. Let's finish that hope chest. Someone's getting married in 2 weeks, and they're counting on us. Jesse closed his journal and joined Colt at the workbench. Together they worked into the night, 2 generations bound by craft and choice, building something that would outlast them both. Furniture and legacy, memory and hope. All the things that mattered when you stripped life down to its essentials and started over from nothing but your own two hands and the courage to try.